Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. It is always a big challenge to speak, to moderate right after lunch, because people are still trickling in. So, but I think with the topic that we have for this particular session, should be of great interest to all of us, speaking about the budget that was retabled a few weeks ago. There's a lot of talking points, plenty of questions, and we are very lucky to have with us today Yang Berbahagia Datuk Johan Mahmud Marikan from the Ministry of Finance. Welcome, Datuk. And thank you for making the time to be with us. I noticed you have been since this morning around, and obviously shuttling around between here and Parliament. But also I want to take the opportunity to congratulate you on your appointment as the Secretary General of the Treasury. Let me get straight into it, so to speak, get the ball rolling. This morning we heard from Yang Berhormat PM speech. He mentioned about, if I can put it simply, things will be different this time around under this administration. So maybe my first question to you, from the perspective of the retabled budget 2023, are the focus, the priorities of that materially and fundamentally different than the one tabled in October last year, or are both broadly, essentially similar, but with, some tweaks here and there? I mean, what are the things that you want to emphasize for us here today to take note of about the retabled budget 2013?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. Very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, Swaimi, and also thank you, Bursa and Maybank, for having me here. I think Yang Berhormat Prime Minister has done a really good job this morning about articulating in terms of his thinking behind budget. But allow me just to maybe add on a little bit, and I've got at least just 2 slides maybe just to share with everyone. I think first on, if I just let's get my first slide up next. So I think just to provide a little bit of context to the budget. So on one hand, there are some bits that can't change much from 7 October. So as you know, a budget process typically starts, middle of the year, and it's probably a 6 months process. That process of a budget screening in terms of the allocation that went to individual ministries could not vary that much. Having said that, there was obviously scope for an increase in allocation, but I'll come back to that later. So whilst there's some parts in terms of the nuts and bolts which could not change much because by its very nature, it's a retabling done by the new government within a relatively short space of time. But I think in terms of budget presentation, it's actually completely different in the sense that, typically, a budget speech by past ministers of finance would typically be almost like a laundry list. Okay, Bumi dapat berapa, China dapat berapa, okay, you dapat berapa, that sort of. And I think being the first budget by Prime Minister, I think he really wanted to spend a bit more time sharing in terms of his thinking and the direction he's going in. So in terms of presentation, what you see first, I think in the Prime Minister's speech, one, he was very transparent in terms of the challenges that face the country. So whether it's the high debt, and even Prime Minister made reference to the fact that debt and liability is already 1.5 trillion, which is equivalent to 81% of GDP, obviously the highest that we've had. And that combined with also a very high debt service cover ratio, debt service ratio of now, our interest payments alone for 2023 is going to be 46 billion, which is more than 16%. And that's already crossing our long-held 15% threshold that we've kept. That combined with perhaps a global outlook that obviously is more uncertain this year compared to last year. Then on top of that, in terms of competitiveness and investments, whilst GDP has already recovered to beyond pre-COVID levels, as you know, private investments still remain below pre-COVID. If it was about 328 billion pre-COVID, now it's still hovering about 290 billion. So that's one key challenge that we face. And of course, Prime Minister spoke a lot about the scourge of corruption as being one of the key challenges facing the country. We talk about the corruption perception index. We're now wallowing at 60s We once were, at 29. And on top of that, I think Prime Minister also spoke about the challenge of how many of Malaysians, face the challenges of high cost of living, combined to quite uneven development across the country. So those were the challenges that were set out against Prime Minister, against which then he articulated his vision for the new government to then provide a holistic reform agenda, obviously through Madani or script in English. This obviously within the budget was of three thrusts, as mentioned by the Prime Minister: driving economic growth, institutional reform, and social justice. So maybe just, next slide. So maybe just to give a little bit more articulation in terms of what that means. I think in terms of, on the growth side, PM spoke about driving growth that's both inclusive and sustainable. And I think in this particular space, the Prime Minister wanted to signal a few things. I mean, one was signaling that this is a responsible government. As you know, the deficit for 2023 has been reduced to 5%, which is even lower than what was presented in 7 October, which was 5.5%, and also fiscal reforms such as a commitment to table the Fiscal Responsibility Act. But at the same time, while it is a responsible reduction in deficit, it is also expansionary. Our latest estimations, projections for revenues allow us then to basically provide an increase, for example, in development expenditure, projecting 97 billion on top of basically also higher expenditure on the OE side. At the same time, which I think you'll probably come to in a bit, is Prime Minister is very clear in terms of a very progressive approach to taxation. My previous minister was ex-banker, so quite a capitalist, whereas you've heard of him earlier this morning. Prime Minister obviously champions a lot more on social justice, as you have heard. So I think hence you see that stronger emphasis, and I'm sure we can talk about the taxes later, but on top of that, a key focus even for micro SMEs. I think the part on institutional governance, I think PM spoke at length already about the issue of corruption, but Prime Minister often reminds us that the rakyat is impatient. He also is impatient, so he's driving various things to be expedited, whether it's fixing dilapidated schools, fixing, quickly rolling out our flood mitigation programs, addressing some of the rakyat problems like congestion hospitals. I think these are things that Prime Minister is very, very much emphasizing public sector reform as part of the budget. And maybe just shifting to social justice, we've heard his ambition. He wants to completely address hardcore poverty. I think that's something you would heard from YB Rafizi as well. But on top of that, there's also elements of support for B40 and M40 in addressing the cost of living. And on top of that, we talk about respect. We're talking about a more socially just development. There's also elements looking at to our development expenditure, how we can then try to reduce, obviously, the development disparities between different parts of the country. So hopefully this gives you a bit of an anchor in terms of how the thinking of the challenges that face the country, this holistic approach that Prime Minister has articulated in terms of growth, governance, and justice, which then translates to key measures, which hopefully then brings down the Madani concept, I think down one level to what maybe more people can appreciate as perhaps a first step of many of the direction that the government is taking.
Thank you, Dato', for that sort of quick run-through of the retable budget. To be honest with you, the feedback that I get from obviously capital market players is tax measures are perhaps the key highlights of this budget, especially the restructuring of the personal and SME income tax, the luxury goods tax, the capital gains tax. I think obviously that brings up the words progressive and redistributive sort of aspect of the tax measures and kind of gels with the budget's pillar of upholding social justice and combat inequality. Again, this morning, Prime Minister's speech also gave a little bit more color about the capital gains tax, CGT. Obviously, re-emphasizing the fact that it's on non-listed, sort of a share disposal. It won't in any way affect listed shares. He mentioned about very low rate, and obviously in the process, and I think IPO disposal is also not going to be impacted by this capital gains tax. But I'm going to perhaps trying to get or trying to turn those some colours provided by Prime Minister to try to get maybe more of a picture of this CGT. Obviously, first and foremost, trying to understand the thoughts behind the implementation of this particular scope or type of CGT, because while it's not going to affect, obviously, the public markets, but I guess there are concerns expressed about the implication to PE activities, to M&A activities. And I'm also reminded by the fact that when the government want to introduce that tax on foreign source income, initially pretty gung-ho, is going to be implemented quite fast, but after engagement with stakeholders, shareholders, and various parties, the implementation is deferred by quite a number of years. So I guess with all those in mind, together with potential things that need to be considered when implementing capital gains tax of the ones presented in the budget, because of things like what you call a tax and trust plannings and all that. How confident is it that the government can implement it in 2024, or will there need a bit more time to do this?
So thank you for that. It's certainly one of the popular questions. Maybe I should dial back a step to perhaps give a bit of context of where the Prime Minister is thinking. So in the lead up to budget, obviously everyone was telling the Prime Minister he needed to announce a commitment to his GST. And I think on that front, maybe some may have been disappointed, but where the Prime Minister was coming from, and as he also attempted to explain in the budget speech, he was saying that a GST by definition is regressive. And this is at a time when, whilst you may say that our inflation rate is still fairly moderate at 3.3% last year, but obviously there are elements like food inflation that's already at 5.8%, and that obviously affects the poorer segments of society even more. So he felt that this was perhaps not the time to immediately implement GST. And he said if the point was then to broaden the tax base, we should first, before impacting the poor, we should first start off with those perhaps better able to afford. And even if you notice the difference in the individual tax rates that was announced, on one hand, it was an enhancement of 7 October. So in 7 October, we announced a 2% tax cut for those who had taxable income between 50,000 to 100,000. This was then broadened to be a 2% tax cut from 35,000 to 100,000, which obviously benefited about 2.4 million people, with costing government almost 900 million. But against that, there's also this element where the higher bands, there was an increase in tax. But as you know, only those who are earning about 20,000 a month and above are subject to even additional. In fact, if you're at 20,000, you probably pay about 200 ringgit extra tax. But the point was that it only affects 150,000. And you put that in the context of labour force, that's only like 1% at most of the labour force. And I think the thinking there is that, that modest increase is yes, but I think Prime Minister also wanted to send a signal that that's a fairly small segment compared to, shall we say, a much broader group where if we're having the more than 2 million wage earners being taxed on income tax, why is it then that there's none being imposed on gains by capitalists? I think that was just a signal. But of course, by sending a signal, he was then at pains to say that, one, it will not affect the capital markets. I think he reinforced it this morning in his speech by giving a reassurance that there'll definitely not be any tax on listed shares, nor on those going for IPO. Those paragraphs were not put in by Bursa. This came from Prime Minister, but obviously always good to be good to be nice to the host as well. But at the same time, Prime Minister also gave that commitment. I mean, we're certainly going to do extensive engagement, certainly for capital gains and luxury tax. Those are the ones that many have asked us questions. I think I would say that we as the bureaucrats at Ministry of Finance have probably learned our lesson from FSI. So we're certainly committed to doing very extensive engagement with stakeholders. And certainly, capital gains tax is almost like a shift in approach. So certainly, it's something that needs to be backed up by legislation, which we hope to perhaps be able to finance the details in time for the budget 2024. But certainly extensive engagement is required. But it's just part of that broader thinking of Prime Minister that let us first start by those who are more able, and he felt it's more equitable in that respect.
Since this morning, Yama Bromat PM give some colors about CGT, are you up to give some colors on the luxury goods tax as well?
Oh yes, I'm probably in a room full that's probably more concerned about luxury goods tax than the average population. Um, okay, it is not obvious. We've had a luxury tax before, and as all of you know, we had waived it in the past. Taking into account the considerations of promoting tourism. I think this is something that the Prime Minister has asked us to revisit. It's something that we will then. I think the key part is how do we define what are products that are going to be subject to luxury tax, and above what threshold value, which you then impose what would be probably an additional sales tax. So this is again something that we're committed to do extensive engagement, particularly with the retail and obviously tourism sector, and it's something that we hope to clarify this year.
I want to move on to other tax measures, particularly with this thing about adopting the global minimum effective tax rate of 15% through the implementation of this qualified domestic minimum top-up tax, QDMTT. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding or the reason for the global minimum effective tax rate is because of the low effective corporate income tax rate due to incentives. And hence the issue of this base erosion, profit shifting, and so on. Will the implementation of global minimum effective tax rate affect our incentive to FDI, to MNCs in the future? I mean, after all, I've been hearing probably the last 5 years, maybe 7 years, about government wanting to review incentives anyway. I mean, we'd like to hear your comment on that.
I think there are two different, there are two parts to this. I think one is the structure of the Malaysian tax system, and the other one is in terms of global developments. So if we just look in terms of Malaysian tax system, certainly there's an issue. In fact, many countries, many would always say to look to Singapore as being a relatively low tax base. But if you look at tax as a percentage to GDP, Malaysia has the lowest in the region at about 11.3%. The likes of Singapore is at 13%, and most of the other countries like Thailand, Vietnam, and the rest are 15% and above. And part of that comes back to what you mentioned, is that we have a relatively low effective tax rate, whilst the corporate tax rate is at 24%. The effective tax rate is actually only at 15% by virtue of various incentives. And I think there's a sense that perhaps, if you compare against Singapore, we're perhaps a bit less targeted in the way we give incentives. And I think you've heard from even Prime Minister in the budget speech that he's basically instructing MOF and MITI Maida to relook at our incentives. One, in terms of perhaps needing to be more targeted towards promoting quality investments. But there's also this aspect of our incentives, and you'll be very familiar, we have one of our, largest incentives is investment tax allowance, where the tax shield is a function of the capital expenditure invested by the investor. But that has a risk of then being biased towards very capex heavy industries, which are not, which then may be very labor and energy intensive, but not necessarily value adding. I think so. One of the messaging in Prime Minister's speech is how do we ensure that we transform our incentive system to be something that's more targeted towards quality investments, but also better linked to investments that create quality jobs or higher income jobs, and also linkages with SMEs. So that's one part that we need to undertake on our own as part of having a better targeted incentive or tax structure for the country. But at the same time, due to global developments, we have this scenario where obviously there'll be a minimum tax rate. So, the OECD is imposing this, and so what would happen, say, I guess if you take a big MNC, let's say, I don't know, say Intel, if it pays no taxes, say in Malaysia, by virtue of the various tax incentives that it receives, it will then be subject to taxes in their home country. So it's it's a loss in a sense. There's no value then to the incentive that's being provided, and we then lose the opportunity to get that income. So I think that's why you would have heard that even countries, even in Singapore's recent budget, they announced the intention to also introduce global minimum taxes in 2025. But I think the approach is not that, it's not so much in terms of, oh, okay, we've given incentives to all these FDIs, now's the time that we're suddenly going to tax them. I think there probably needs to be a conversation with our investors. How do perhaps transform some of these incentives? You know, if tax-free or zero taxes or pioneer status ceases to be effective for these type of international investors, perhaps then we need to look at incentives that's better tied to, again, what Prime Minister is saying, you know, maybe the incentives are then tied towards grants that support linkages with SMEs, grants that support to creating high-income jobs. So it's more just basically how do we then transform, and perhaps we could then use the imposition of a minimum tax to then help finance some of these new types of incentives.
Got it. The other thing that kind of caught my attention about the retable budget 2023 is this third round of special voluntary disclosure program. Let's call it SVDP. My question is the reason for this kind of repeated use of SVDP is because the returns from the last two SVDPs exceeded expectations in terms of revenue, in terms of expanding taxpayers' base, in terms of improving compliance impact.
Okay, so I think also to dial it back to 2018, obviously we still continue to have an issue. If you look at the number of companies that pay taxes, certainly is much less than total registered. And when at least when 2018, when the PH government came in, there was a presumption that perhaps if there's less trust in how government is using its funds, perhaps that would be one reason for perhaps lower compliance. I think then the government at that time then took its opportunity to say, you know, we're very committed towards, particularly in terms of governance reform, you know, please, we're giving you the opportunity to pay your taxes, which then will be on a promise that is going to be well utilized. So I think that's the main premise. It is true that back in 2018, the returns were certainly more than you expected. I think crossed 7 billion. But I think the repeat, I think, is similar. It is in a similar context. The Prime Minister has announced, a clear commitment towards governance reform, and again, a call towards companies to then be compliant, at least giving them this window of opportunity to be compliant. But at the same time, it's also timed also together with our introduction of our tax identification number. So again, we believe that's also another motivation to encourage companies to come forward, and where under this SVDP, whether it's for income tax or custom-related taxes, where we will waive the penalties.
Actually, does MOF have some sort of estimate what's the untapped or undeclared tax base in terms of potential revenues, in terms of the numbers of individuals and business taxpayers?
Yeah, I don't have that. I don't have the number in terms of what's the potential universe. But as mentioned, last time we had 7 billion. This time, obviously, that time there wasn't held SVP for a very long time. I think this time, obviously, the gap is less. So I don't think we're not expecting as much in this current round. So, you know, order magnitude billion or thereabouts.
Right. It's just interesting that this round you have it both on IRB and Royal Customs. The last two, first one was IRB, the second was Royal Customs. And I thought this time around even more generous in the sense that there's no penalty attached, if I'm not mistaken. There's no penalty attached for declaration and all that. I mean, the last two have penalties, but on the sort of a discounted basis or something like that. But anyway, I think we've spent quite a fair bit on the budget 2023. A lot of it revolve around taxes. I want to go to something beyond 2023, more medium to longer term. And obviously, one key topic is on fiscal reforms. And we have this target, bringing down budget deficit to 3.2% of GDP by 2025, from a 5% projected for this year. My calculation is the value of budget deficit has to come down to 68 billion ringgit thereabout by then, from about 94 billion projected for this year. I mean, that's obviously based on MOF medium-term fiscal framework. Can Dato' first share what are the general or broad strategies before we go into the specific subsequent questions with regards to the revenues and expenditures to kind of expedite to realize the targeted consolidation in budget deficit in the general terms, perhaps.
Okay, thank you. So I think, again, in terms of context, I think Prime Minister clearly is someone very keen to articulate that the government will be fiscally responsible. In fact, the last time we had a surplus budget was when Prime Minister was Minister of Finance back in 1998. Back then, our government debt was only 103 billion. It's now 1080 billion, it's more than 10 times. So I think Prime Minister, I think it's very much part of his thinking that we need to be fiscally responsible. So I think that's one key context. But at the same time, we also want to ensure that it's not too drastic. Fiscal consolidation is one that's done gradually, ensure that we continue to be expansionary and promote the growth momentum. In terms of bringing down the deficit, there are some perhaps one-off items perhaps that will help that consolidation. For example, as you may be aware, this month the government will have to repay the US $3 billion bond on 1MDB. Last year when we paid the US $3.5 billion bond, we actually had sufficient from asset recovery to fully redeem it. This year, that 3 billion, or well, approximately RM 13 billion will be actually paid for from government allocation. That's a 13 billion, on its own a reduction for next year. So in terms of bringing it down to low 4% for next year, it's almost taking out that one-off item. I think it'd be relatively achievable. But that's a one-off. I think the other part that we're obviously continuing to look at is certainly we spoke a bit about taxes. I think that there needs to be some sequencing, and even if the thinking is not to immediately implement GST, we certainly need to look at how can we improve the coverage, whether in terms of both our existing SST, in terms of how we can improve that. That's in addition to whatever tax measures that's already announced in Budget 2023. But in terms of one key focus for the government, certainly needs to be to address the subsidies. I know a lot has been spoken about targeted subsidies. I think this government also certainly looking at it. We've seen already the Prime Minister taking this, I'm not sure what you call it, tiered approach. Looking at Tan Sri Wahid, he was obviously at PNB before, and you see that, typically PNB for ASB would announce a flat dividend. You saw that the Prime Minister opted for the slightly tiered approach. Some say Robin Hood. I'm not sure he'll like that analogy, but where I think 87% of ASB holders got 5.1 cent dividend, whereas 13% only got 4.6. That was, I think, a first step in showing this slightly tiered approach. The next one was in terms of electricity. For the first half, the tariffs were broadly maintained for households and PKS, but was obviously increased for the non-PKS. And the thinking behind that is when you look at the electricity subsidy, for example, if we had not changed, not adjusted any tariffs for electricity, we would have faced more than 12 billion subsidy for just electricity in the first 6 months. And the point is that the bigger companies, which are not PKS, there are about 100,000 of them, and then the high usage domestic users, which are more than 600 kilowatts or a bill of about 230 ringgit a month, that's about another 900,000. That 1 million users, which are only 10% of TNB customers, actually account for 50% of the subsidy. So I think so clearly in having these broad-based blanket subsidies, a lot of it is a leakage to unintended recipients. So I think electricity is probably the first one that we'll be looking at, given that by naturally it's ease of implementation and also more targeted. But that's probably the start, and we need to look further in terms of I know again, reference to Tanji Wahid, as EPU minister, he always would track the consumption of diesel. And certainly what we're seeing today is that the diesel being sold at petrol stations is certainly well above what was sold previous time. So again, suggesting a leakage of subsidized diesel to, let's say, construction sites or to factories. I think that's another area that we can certainly looking at to trim. So I think that's an approach, again, by Prime Minister to say, we will continue to help protect perhaps the lower income, the masses, but we need to reduce the leakage perhaps to those who really shouldn't be benefiting from subsidy. I mean, Prime Minister said it a few times, subsidies are intended for the poor or not for the wealthy.
Interesting that you touch on the issue of subsidy, because I think on broad subsidy reforms, the way I see it right now is the government is, number one, is tackling low-hanging fruits, like targeted electricity subsidy, because I suppose it's easy to implement. There's billing system, you know who's who. And then the other thing, my sense is accepting reality that some subsidies, no matter how well-intentioned it is, can result in unintended consequences, like leakages, smuggling, as well as, like in this case of chicken and eggs price subsidies. I think it created a problem on production, on availability of supply. So on that note, what are the other low-hanging fruits and reality checks on subsidies that the government is considering next? And of course, that question in a way, kind of trying to get some sort of clarity with regards to fuel subsidy, because looking at the budget, nothing was said on that. I guess we can assume for now, the current system stays, but what's the game plan here?
I think as you can see that in budget 2023, we're still provided for subsidies. There are obviously some parliamentarians that noted a reduction in subsidy. That's very much in line with the reduction in the assumption of oil prices, partly because it was, we spent 50 billion just on the fuel-related subsidies in 2022, a function of oil prices at 100. Our assumption for 2023 is around $80, and so there's a reduction. But budget 2023 still is premised on a continuation of a large portion of the subsidies. I think the government has said it's committed to at least help the poorer or the masses with that. But coming back to your point, I think that's where we discussed about the need to rationalize. And so beyond electricity, I think another one that we really need to address is diesel. Again, that's less of a rakyat-centric subsidy, more for commercial. There are some existing methods currently where, for example, public transport, they have a fleet card that enables them to buy diesel at a low price. Perhaps that needs to be expanded with a higher pump price in order to facilitate a lower level of leakage. So those are amongst the things that we'll probably be looking at next. I think petrol, there needs to be a bit more time. I mean, just to be transparent, as you highlighted, the ease of implementation of a targeted subsidy for electricity obviously is much easier than compared to petrol. So I think that's why it needs to be sequenced. I think your point on chicken and eggs, I think that's why there's the announcement by the government that needs to be phased out by the middle of the year. It's a big, I think that's where, I think in the previous administration, when they introduced the chicken and egg subsidy, I think what was underestimated was the big difference in supply chain. So when you want to provide subsidy on petrol, it's quite straightforward. You've got 6 main petrol companies, their cost structures are similar. You set a same subsidy rate. I think all can still continue to be profitable. I think the challenge for, say, chicken and egg is that it ranges from huge players like from Leong Hap and CP down to small ribbon ayam at the back of the house. So I think the issue is that when you try to then fix one level of subsidy at the farm and expect to control one ceiling price at the retail point, what you then struggle with is that, yes, maybe it works for the larger producers, but the smaller producers, they don't have perhaps the working capital, they have to go through middlemen and such. And so they then chose to cut back on production, which then obviously affected supply. So I think that's some of the distortions that you mentioned. So I think there's obviously that due care that needs to be addressed whenever we look at subsidies, and that's a classic example of market disruption. And it comes back also to electricity, right? So if we are continuing to subsidize even the high voltage users, it reduces their incentive to adopt, say, solar panels or energy efficient technologies. So I think that's where the importance that even if we want to protect the poor or the masses, we need to send the right market signals to the high electricity consumption users, so then at least they would respond accordingly.
So I guess you also need to keep one eye on inflation as well. And I guess that's also the reason why, another favorite subject by everyone is GST, still a no-show. But, we can't stop talking about it, have this love-hate relationship with GST. But, with all these tax measures announced in Budget 2023, and those that are planned to come on board from 2024 onwards, I'm just thinking aloud. Are we in the situation where the government finds itself having quite a lot of alternatives on the table as opposed to introducing or reintroducing GST again? And it might be other plans like carbon tax, for example. I mean, what from government perspective are the sort of a tax strategy going forward? Because one of the things that we're waiting for quite some time is this medium-term revenue strategy that, again, still a no-show. But is there something that's coming our way soon to sort of give us a bit more color in terms of the strategy on that point, on that side?
It must be my good fortune. The moment you mentioned GST, it says time's up and the minister has arrived.
I was told again I can stretch it for another 5 minutes, actually.
But I should pick up on the point that you mentioned about inflation, because another aspect that we need to look at as we aim to potentially rationalize subsidies to be more targeted is that, as you're probably aware, DOSM has estimated if we completely just remove all price subsidies, inflation would jump up from its current 3.3% to about 11%, and certainly that's not something we would want. So in any case, when we relook at how we want to manage subsidies, it needs to be done in a holistic manner, but beyond that, it needs to be sequenced accordingly and implemented gradually so that it does not then translate to runaway inflation. So I think that's also another constraint or consideration that we need to take into account as we look into the management of subsidies. But in terms of other taxes, it's certainly not in the current minds. You said there are many options. I think the Prime Minister's already mentioned, luxury tax and capital gains tax. We'll focus on that for now. We're not looking at any other taxes at the moment. I think I would have to say conversations about carbon tax potentially are a little bit premature, given that we continue to subsidize fuel. So I think let us move away from subsidies on carbon-related or fuel-related before we're even in a position to track. But work is ongoing. I think the relevant ministries are preparing in terms of the necessary legislation to track carbon, what is then to have a consistent measure as, I guess, preparatory work towards that.
Unfortunately, that's all that we have right now. As usual, time sure flies when I am having fun asking questions rather than answering questions. Thank you very much, Dato'.